But I'll start my opening remarks, say a few words about what Claremont does and why we do it, and then we'll get down to business. Let me start big. The mission of the Claremont Institute is to save Western civilization. We've always aimed high. We think, and I think, we've been at a turning point for some time. We will either once again recover the principles of statesmanship that made this country great, or we'll sink into moral and intellectual decline, defeat, and confusion. We agree with our longtime distinguished fellow, Harry Jaffa, that the crisis of the West today can only be met and resolved by America. It's only America, animated by the laws of nature and nature's God, that will sustain and restore a government of civil and religious liberty. And in America today, because of our long-standing political and intellectual landscape, the crisis can only be met and resolved by the so-called political right. But if the right is to have any chance, conservatism has to lead the way. And to do this, conservatism has to return to the principles of the American founding and their noble and intelligent defense by our great statesmen and thinkers. We have to return to these principles not because they're old or because they are ours, although they are both, but also because they are true and they're really the only necessary foundation for a good, happy, and peaceful country. So what's our strategy at the Claremont Institute? What is our work? How do we restore America's principles and save the West? Those modest goals. Well, we teach, we write, and promote high-minded and public-spirited scholarship. We engage the great issues of public affairs by helping leaders to apply principles to politics and policy. We teach in our 4 fellowship programs, which I mentioned. We support, help publish, and promote books about constitutionalism, limited government, and the most important issues facing our country. And we write, of course, in our Claremont Review of Books, wonderfully edited by Charles Kesler. The CRB, as it's affectionately known to many of you, is a magazine that engages the most important ideas about America and American political thought, culture, and history, and seeks a serious application of those questions to the policy and political battles today. And our Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence, which is run by John Eastman, helps to steer judges and their clerks towards the correct and principled arguments that have to guide them in the most consequential cases. And finally, we have now over 650 fellowship alumni working in leading positions in politics, media, in opinion institutions in Washington, here in New York, Texas, California, and around the country. Through our alumni programming and soon working groups in Washington, D.C., we continue to educate them and learn from them about the day-to-day policy and political challenges they seek, and then we collaborate with them to restore constitutional government. Now, I don't need to tell any of you how urgent this question of education is, with a higher education establishment increasingly enthralled, it seems, to identity politics, star chamber proceedings, the violent suppression of speech. The need for serious alternatives has never been greater. So with this state of affairs and with the national political landscape in a time of great disruption, we have plans for expansion at the Claremont Institute to continue this scholarship and its application to help current and future policymakers, judges, politicians, and opinion leaders find their way with a firm grounding in proper principles and justice rightly understood. Policy changes day to day, but the goal must always be to restore a regime of the equal protection of equal individual rights, not group rights. This is a big task, of course, but it's one we take on with friends, with supporters, with great camaraderie. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning at the Claremont Institute, and I'm very grateful to be here with all of you tonight, together in this fight, and I thank you for your support. And with that, I'd like to get down to business. So I'll introduce our panelists in the order they will speak, starting with Heather McDonald. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, well known to many of you New Yorkers, of course, a contributing editor of its publication City Journal. She writes extensively on higher education, immigration, criminal justice reform, race relations, and policing, including her latest book, The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe. In 2005, Ms. McDonald was the recipient of the prestigious Bradley Prize. Second, Mark Lilla is a professor of humanities at Columbia University, where he specializes in intellectual history. Before moving to Columbia in 2007, taught on the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago and at NYU, And a few days after the 2016 election, Dr. Lilla published a widely noted op-ed in the New York Times. It was called The End of Identity Liberalism. And he condemned his own party's, quote, moral panic about racial, gender, and sexual identity as the reason for the left's momentous defeat. He's a prolific writer, author of several books, but most notably for our evening here tonight. The book-length treatment that grew out of that article is called The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. Finally, Charles Kesler is the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. He's written extensively on American constitutionalism and political thought and many other important topics, and he's the author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. The book holds up very, very well. I encourage you all to read it or revisit it if you haven't. Actually, Dr. Lilla reviewed it in the New York Times Sunday Book Review back when it came out. It was a glowing review. And we spelled Charles's name just right. Charles's fine edition of Federalist Papers is the best-selling edition in the country. And earlier this year, he was named to the Politico 50, Politico magazine's annual list of the key thinkers, doers, and visionaries who are reshaping American politics and policy. So with that, thank you again for coming. Please welcome the panelists and welcome Heather to the podium.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Williams, and thank the Claremont Institute for inviting me. It's an extraordinary honor to be on a panel with Professors Lilla and Kesler, and I look forward to our discussion. It's going to surprise nobody in this room to say that identity politics is shredding the social fabric. The historian Arthur Schlesinger warned in 1991 of the, quote, disuniting of America, and he was already late to the game in noting the dangers of a radical multiculturalism. It is nevertheless shocking to read the responses to Mark Lilla's recent book, The Once and Future Liberal, for they reveal how utterly taboo it has become in academia and in the liberal media to invoke a unified conception of America. The strategy of response is invariably the following. Any effort on Professor Lilla's part to speak about American history as a whole, or to say anything positive about that history, is immediately shot down as an attempt to paper over the victimization of discrete, identity-based groups. A Columbia law professor accuses Professor Lilla of, quote, striving to make white supremacy respectable again, end quote. Now, what brings on this remarkable charge? Professor Lilla observes in his book that the Founding Fathers established a government based on the guarantee of rights. That foundation, he says, made possible the subsequent expansion of rights to previously disenfranchised groups. Columbia law professor Catherine Frank is having none of this, however. With a level of sarcasm befitting a 12-year-old, she paraphrases Lilla thus, quote, come on, guys, the Founding Fathers created a really great country, get with the program, end quote. Thus, as a law professor, dismissed centuries of political thought and the political system that underwrites her freedom and prosperity. Frank trots out the usual exceptions to earlier rights regimes, specifically females and blacks, exceptions which Professor Lilla readily acknowledges, but she ignores completely his argument that the extension of full suffrage to those groups rested on the original constitutional framework. Likewise, a writer for Viewpoint magazine grows apoplectic that Professor Lilla claims that the civil rights movement addressed, quote, the country as a whole, end quote, and thus was contrary to today's narcissistic identity politics. The Viewpoint writer has no answer to Professor Lilla's claim other than to evoke irrelevantly Martin Luther King's socialist politics. In sum, we see a knee-jerk rejection of anything positive or unifying about the American experience through the reflexive invocation of the failings, real or imagined, of the past or present. This reflex also underwrites the ongoing vilification of UPenn law professor Amy Wax, who's here tonight, for calling for a revival of the bourgeois values of mid-century America. So how do we combat this fracturing of citizen solidarity? By directly taking on the truth claims of today's identity politics. The core premise of those politics is victimology, the charge that the United States is ineradicably and lethally racist, sexist, homophobic, and other sins towards novel victim groups to be determined at some later date. Lest anyone be under a misconception, we are not talking here about a soft multiculturalism, a parade day preference for hyphenated ethnic identities like Hispanic American or Asian American. Nor are we talking about a psychological phenomenon of millennial snowflakes who have been overprotected by helicopter parents, as the estimable Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff argue. No, we are talking about a crusading political ideology that defines identity groups by their alleged oppression at the hands of a hated, allegedly white supremacist, male, cis-normative patriarchy. And the place where we must start in combating this political ideology is the college campus, because that is where the claims of victimhood are the most influential and the most delusional. Just how delusional? Come with me to Princeton in the fall of 2015 as Black Lives Matter protests spread across college campuses nationwide. Princeton black students intoned, quote, "We are sick and tired of being sick and tired." Now, this phrase was first uttered by Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist who was beaten for trying to vote in the 1950s and who grew up on a Mississippi cotton farm. Fannie Lou Hamer had grounds for being sick and tired of being sick and tired. But any Princeton student, I don't care if he's green, purple, or blue, who thinks of himself as downtrodden and oppressed is profoundly out of touch with reality. At Brown, minority students demanded to the provost that they be exempt from traditional academic expectations like attending class or doing homework because they said they had to focus on, quote, staying alive on this campus, end quote. This is not hyperbole. The products of the victimology industrial complex really believe that their lives are at risk from attending these pacific, well-meaning, opportunity-filled institutions. And these preposterous claims of victimhood are never challenged by anyone in authority. At Yale, as you may recall, in 2015, there was an absolutely outrageous outbreak of student incivility towards a college master, cursing, practically physically intimidating, absolutely groundless. Afterwards, Yale's president, Peter Salovey, groveled at the feet of these student boors, promising another $50 million in useless diversity spending and conferring an award on one of the student blowhards. Other college presidents inevitably penitently promised more diversity bureaucracy and more racial preferences in hiring and admissions whenever there's a similar outbreak of student callousness and impoliteness. This hysterical victimology is decimating humanistic learning. Last year, a student Facebook thread at Columbia University erupted in rage at the racist imposition of Columbia's beleaguered core curriculum. Reading such allegedly racist texts and authors as Plato, Kant, and Rousseau put Columbia's students of color at risk of their lives, the Facebook ranters claimed. Yale has just created a new alternative for English majors so that students can avoid having to read Shakespeare and Milton, which according to a student petition, quote, creates a culture that is especially hostile to students of color, end quote. Needless to say, no one on the Yale faculty or the Yale English faculty defended the centrality of Chaucer, Spencer, and Milton. to an understanding of the English tradition. It fell to a graduate of the class of 2010 to defend Yale's traditional English major, and the terms in which she did it speak volumes about student attitudes towards the legacy of Western civilization. To be well-versed in English literature, she wrote in Slate, quote, "You're going to have to hold your nose and read a lot of white male poets." Heaven forbid. To the supporters of the Claremont Institute who rightly believe that the great texts of Western political theory, I say, good luck with that. Such founding texts are now, at best, on the margins of the curriculum, if at all, and the cause of these great works are all the target of know-nothing victimology. This hysterical victimology is also shredding the ideal of free speech and rational discourse on campuses and in the real world, under the argument that what the left insanely defines as hate speech puts victim groups at risk of their lives. Private sector and informal censorship are increasingly the norm. Eventually, government censorship could well follow. Merely intoning about the necessity of free speech to a self-governing republic is not going to make any difference, however, so long as campus-generated victimology remains ascendant. So the next time there is a particularly flagrant outbreak of student delusion, claiming near death at the hands of a racist patriarchy, the college president should stand up and say the following: "Are you kidding me? You are the most privileged human beings in history. You have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. You can read every book that has ever been written, something that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. Everything is open to you. Advanced scientific laboratories, history, languages, everything is available for you to learn. Far from being surrounded by bigots, our faculty is the most open-minded and tolerant group of individuals in human history. Every single one of them wants all of his students to succeed. Far from discriminating against minorities and females, every faculty search is a desperate lunge for remotely qualified minorities and females to hire. Far from discriminating against minorities and females in admissions, we employ vast racial preferences that will continue long after you graduate. In fact, there's not a single mainstream institution today that is not bending itself into knots to hire and promote as many minorities and females as possible. At this very moment, millions of Chinese students are fanatically studying for the privilege of experiencing what you deem a maelstrom of hatred. If you feel so oppressed, step aside and let them take your place. But unless college presidents do the unthinkable and finally strap on some balls, they're never going to say such things. It is therefore incumbent on the rest of us to do so. Of course, this country had and still has failings. Our centuries-long blind spot regarding racial equality is particularly egregious. But the situation today is quite different, and students who persist in believing in their own victimhood will fail to seize the many opportunities available to them and will blight the world for everyone else. Thank you for your attention.
She got to stand like
Well, I'm tempted after that, and especially such a welcome defense of my book, it's been a long time, to just so that my remarks consist in the following: what she said. But I've been paid to say a little more, so First, I want to say that there are a lot of liberals and progressives who are as frustrated about this situation as Heather is, and as many of you must be. You may have already heard this, read this. For all I know, you've read it 100 times. I'm going to read it. A little extemporaneous explosion from Van Jones at an event that David Axelrod ran for students at the University of Chicago, when a student stood up and said, "I don't feel safe." And Van Jones said the following: "I don't want you to feel safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym. You can't live on a campus where people say stuff you don't like, and these people can't fire you, they can't arrest you, they can't beat you up. They can just say stuff you don't like, and you get to say stuff back, and this you can't bear. This is ridiculous BS, liberals. My parents marched, they dealt with fire hoses, they dealt with dogs, they dealt with beatings. You can't deal with the mean tweets? You are creating a kind of liberalism that the moment it crosses the street into the real world is not just useless, but obnoxious and dangerous. So, if I ever run into Van Jones, I will tell him that the Claremont Review is applauding his remarks. Good. I wanted to begin that way in order to say that this is not, the developments we're here to talk about are not just a concern on the right. That for any lucid liberal or progressive, the development of the kind of identity politics that we live with is not good for any political cause. It's not good for the Republic, and therefore it's not good for any of us. I would put my concerns in maybe a different way, in certain respects, than Heather did. Being inside the academy, I see things not quite in quite so dark terms as she does, but that may be a function of being too close to it, actually, not being able to see it clearly. But the most important thing that we have to do is to try to understand why this is happening. It is not sufficient to get up on our soapboxes and denounce this. It is only possible to address it by trying to understand what it's about. And there, we have to do some reflection about American culture, even I would say the American founding and its limitations. We would have to do a lot of thinking about what both sides of the aisle have contributed to some of the conditions in our culture that have made this possible. It is no simple thing that we're facing. In the book, I tell a little story about how all this happened in The Once and Future Liberal, which is available at Amazon.com, where they take these at American Express and recently Bitcoin. The story I tell is this, and it would be interesting for me to hear people on the right tell me whether it resonates with them a little bit or not at all. The story goes like this, and that is that since the 1980s, American politics, and in a certain respect American culture, have been infected with a kind of anti-political libertarianism. And I would have to explain what I mean by political, which I'm happy to do if someone asks. And that a certain kind of libertarianism, a hyper-exaggerated form of a healthy American individualism, has popped up on the right and on the left, beginning in the 1970s. Tom Wolfe was right about it. Other people were right about it. But there was a self-absorption, an unprecedented self-absorption, settled like an alien spacecraft onto American culture. And it showed up in two ways. On the right, in a kind of economic libertarianism, and what became of Reaganism in the 1990s. In the 1980s, you could make the case that Reaganism was simply offered another picture of what we were as a country, what we were as a society, not simply as individuals. And the principle underlying it, one could argue, back in the early 80s in particular, was what is now called subsidiarity. That is that we are a nation, but we're a healthier nation if all these other ties that bind from the bottom up are not snipped, and that from the top down, that when it comes to treating general social problems, we try to use institutions that are already there on the ground, and if one articulates it that way, that sounds very reasonable. And certainly back in the 1980s, when I was an editor of the Public Interest, I was down with that. But then it became something else. And it's important that people on the right face up to this. That they may say it was a good thing that it happened, but it's important to face up to it. And another picture emerged in the 90s when people lost their minds when Bill Clinton became president. And another conservatism, republicanism, developed. It was articulated, to my mind, most perfectly by the throbbing id of the current right, and that's Grover Norquist, who said, "My ideal citizen is a self-employed, homeschooling, IRA-owning guy with a concealed weapon permit. Because that guy doesn't need the goddamn government for anything." Yeah. That's not my America. That is not a social vision of America. A view of subsidiarity, the kind of things you can read about in national affairs, if you look back at the Public Interest in the 1980s, was not about that at all. It was about a picture of a republic, not a campsite, not a parking lot, not a place where we drive our cars in and plug into the electricity and the water and the Wi-Fi and pull out in the morning. When you live in a republic, you have duties to each other. The most important virtue is solidarity, and with that, public duty and sacrifice. That disappeared on the right, not just on the left. Now, what happened on the left? Well, we got identity politics, which was a different kind of individualism. And it led to this kind of weird bifurcation in American politics, in the sense that on the left, there was an assertion of a radical individualism when it came to social traditions, religion, the family, but an assertion of the demands and the, not only demands, but the responsibilities of the public when it came to political and economic matters, you can argue. On the other hand, on the right, you had the reverse of that. People who wanted economic liberty, unfettered liberty, and relatively, and individualism, but wanted a conservative social message where the demands of society, family, and all the rest were in place. And The result of that is that both political sides were in complete contradiction with themselves. And the only perfectly consistent people were libertarians, who called for perfect liberty on both sides. So, if you don't accept that libertarian picture, then you have some serious thinking to do. Not just about the rise of identity politics and the narcissism that came with that, but also the self-regard and narcissism and indifference to the common good that grew up on the right ever since the 1980s, where government was the problem. Well, I'm sorry, government is not the problem. You do not have a free market that functions unless you have a functioning government that's authoritative. There are reasons that we have social protections for the common good and even for economic reasons. And there needs to be a crisis of conscience, both on the left and on the right, about this selective individualism. So I argue in this wonderful book. Now, my argument in the book is that when it comes to identity politics, is that it's an expression of this individualism, because you can imagine a politics, I mean, many things go on in politics. You have an appeal to the nation, you can have an appeal to an interest group, you can even have an appeal to an identity group that becomes a kind of interest group in the sense that we share a common concern, right? And then you enter politics and become politically engaged to persuade people to join with you in a coalition because you have needs and they have needs. That's all perfectly normal. What changed on the left was that identity politics became a politics of the intimate self. And it became a therapeutic politics of the self, where it's not only, so the language is not that of identification. I identify with the nation, or I identify, if I'm an African American, with African American history and the sufferings and the bravery and everything that happened in it. But rather my identity is this little special thing within, this little homunculus that needs tending to, that it is a unique mix of all these things I decide are part of my identity. And so it becomes this little homunculus that you can report on. Well, my identity is not feeling too well today. Gee, I'm sorry to hear that, right? And that led, as I argue in the book, to a certain kind of political engagement that made it impossible to create a message on the Democratic side that appealed to what we share and the country we want to build together. That's the story I tell. Now, the most interesting critique of this view that I've articulated has come from conservatives. And here I don't say the right, but genuine conservatives. And I mean David Brooks, Ross Douthat, and most recently Mary Eberstadt. They have argued that identity politics is not an expression of individualism and atomization in our society, but rather it's an awkward attempt to find belonging in a society where we are incredibly atomized today, not just because of our politics and our ideology, because of our technology, because of the web, and all, you fill in the list. And if anything, and I'm trying to think hard about that, whether they're right about that, and I was wrong. But it would only, if they're right, point to a deeper malady, which is that we live in a hyper-atomized society in which it's very hard to make the case that people owe anything to other people, that they have public duties. You've got to pay your goddamn taxes. This is a country. And it's important that people serve in the military. It's important that people do teach for America. This shows that you care and that you are a citizen. And that went missing even in the Reagan years. What were the slogans What was the slogan for the Army during the Reagan years? It changed in 1980. Be all you can be. Talk about the me decade. And in the George Bush administration, it was changed to an Army of One, which was more bellicose, but still about me. And Republicans and people on the right have not since Reagan been able to articulate a sense of what makes this a country, where we have duties to each other. And I see many elements of Trumpism as being an attempt to capture that. They have people on the right say, turns out we owe things to our workers. Who knew that people who suddenly find the factories that disappear from central Ohio, that we have a stake in that because they're citizens. Citizens are not roadkill, I'm sorry. We have a responsibility. And if you're responsible on the right, you have an obligation to articulate why you think we owe things to people. Not just because we go to church, and not just because this is American in a sentimental sense, but economically, why do we owe things to each other? Both the right and left have to get over this libertarianism. And in my view, we're living in a visionless country right now. No one has articulated a view of the common good and our common destiny with optimism in the way that Reagan did. And our short-term future will belong to whichever party can do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here and to see so many CRB readers and even better subscribers. And of course, it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues of mine and to be convened by Ryan Williams here, the new president of the Claremont Institute. And as a Harvard product myself, it's nice to be at the Harvard Club, that hotbed of identity politics. And indeed, Harvard has its own controversy about this because the Puritans are mentioned in the last stanza of the official Harvard song, Fair Harvard. And there's a big movement underway to strip out this reference to Puritans who were, as you know, they included white males and had some reactionary ideas, as well as actually some quite progressive ideas for their time. But if you actually look at the second stanza of Fair Harvard, this is what it says about the Puritans. Let not moss-covered error moor thee at its side. Obviously written in the 19th century, nobody writes like that anymore. As the world on truth's current glides by, be the herald of light and the bearer of love till the stock of the Puritans die. So actually, I mean, whatever it's worth, it identifies the Puritans with light and love, and with progress, with the current of truth gliding by. And Puritans shouldn't shun that current. They should be in the stream of truth. But what don't they like about Puritans? Well, many things, of course, but it has something to do with the fact that the kind of identity politics that Harvard, you might say, once had about whether you were waspy enough to be a member of the Harvard Club, was always, in a sense, subordinated to the question of what you knew and what you could know and your talents and your abilities and your character. The Puritans, after all, are not an identity group in the modern sense of the term. You can become a Puritan. It is a matter of belief. It's a matter of faith. Of course, many Indians, Native Americans did become Christians and even Puritans at some point. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the problem that Mark Lilla's book concerns, but I wanted to begin by, first of all, praising it and praising him because it takes a certain amount and a certain kind of courage to write a book like this, especially if you are on the left, as Mark is and as he acknowledges he is. If you happen to have read the New York Times' review of his book, it was very dismissive, nasty even, I would say, and very curt. It was not generous, it did not engage his argument, it simply caricatured it and him, and that is, I'm afraid, a lot of the reaction that he and his book have received. Having said that, there are some things that I disagree with about the book. Let me say what a few of these are, and then in turn from the book to the issues that the book addresses. And I think we should discuss these differences in the question and answer period. First of all, it's not clear to me that identity politics, in the sense in which he talks about it, began in the 80s. It seems to be more natural to go back to the 60s. And indeed, in his book, he does talk about the 60s and about the good and bad aspects of the 1960s and their reaction later on in the 70s and 80s and in other decades of American politics. But if you go back to the 60s, I think it's hard to maintain that hyper-individualism is somehow at the heart of identity politics today. Identity politics is a strange thing, and his treatment of it in the book follows the contours of this strangeness. It is, on the one hand, a very individual politics. Young women identify with the cause of feminism, blacks and Hispanics and all sorts of people identify American liberalism before even the 1960s. When Woodrow Wilson wrote a textbook in political science at the end of the 19th century, a textbook that he called, revealingly, The State. He began the textbook with the following question: which races shall we study? And why would you begin with an inquiry into race? And the answer to that question, by the way, is the one race you have to study is the Aryan race. There are many other races in the world, and to be thorough, you have to study them all, but who has time for that? It is better to study the race that has conquered and that reigns in the world, and not races like the Hittites and others that have been extinguished, that have lost their battles, that have proven less than fit, because the verdict of history is a kind of group verdict, and it is a Darwinian verdict. It is survival of the fittest. In a way, American liberalism has always anchored individual rights in some account of a larger group. The most fashionable one was race at the end of the 19th century when Wilson was writing. And in a certain sense, American liberalism is exactly, or is almost exactly, at the same place it was 100 years or more ago. Liberalism, especially the campus version, is fascinated by race, by sub-rational factors of identity, race, ethnicity, gender, and other such things, except that all of the winning races and the losing races have exchanged sides. And now it is the Aryan race, the white race, whatever you want to call it, that is culpable and guilty, and the others that have been suppressed unfairly that now require liberalism's balm and liberalism's renewed attention and celebration. But in all of this, actual individualism, the notion that human beings have rights, that the purpose of politics is to protect those rights qua human being, all of these ideas that inhabit the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the American political tradition at its best, tend to get shoved aside. And the final thing I would raise as a criticism of the book, or as at least a point of discussion concerning the book, is the influence of postmodernism, which is another aspect of life on campus these days and of intellectual life everywhere. In a way, a very similar book to this was written many years ago in 1999 by Richard Rorty, a very famous American philosophy professor, famous postmodernist himself. He wrote a book in 1999 called Achieving Our Country. The point of it was that in the 1960s, as a result of their loss, their inability to stop the Vietnam War and to overthrow the fascist power structures of the country, the avant-garde left, abandoned politics, and retreated to the university. And when they did this, they began to run the university and reshape it in their own image. Many of the problems that Heather was pointing to follow from that epic development. But it's, this was a mistake. And he argues liberals should become interested in winning elections again, just as Mark argues in his book. They have to abandon the cultural liberalism of the academy for a pragmatic political liberalism. In doing so, however, they can't forget that postmodernism is true. That is, they can't forget that there is no justice out there. There is no right and wrong in nature or in reality that we can grasp and live our lives in the light of. These are all cultural ideas. They are made, not found. They are artifacts of the will to power and the struggle for power and the struggle, in a way, for existence. Rorty didn't hide that fact. He made clear that there is no truth or justice out there. What makes you a liberal is that you hate humiliation. You hate seeing some people treated as second class and others not. And your hatred for that, said Rorty, is not rational. It is an emotion. It is a sensitivity. But it is no less rational than any other emotion or sensitivity. So you can build your life around it and turn it into the core of a democratic dogma with which you can go out and win elections and make life better for everybody, especially those who are in danger of being treated as second class or being humiliated by other human beings. What's missing, in a way, in Mark's book is an account of refuting postmodernism, or at least coming to grips with the questions that postmodernism pronounces on. Now, he's written about Foucault and others before, and written actually very well about Foucault in particular in a previous book of his, but there's very little of that in this book. And I wonder, what is this citizenship? What are the principles? What is true about it? What's his account of that? And how are we to come to grips with Rorty's own version of modern liberalism, which is explicitly said to be not true, but it doesn't have to be true. It's useful in our search for power. And that brings me to my final remarks about the issues. I wanted to say a little bit more about the contrast between today's radicals on campus and the 60s radicals. There's a connection between them. But there's also a very remarkable difference, I think, between them. And I wanted to say something briefly about that. I want to talk about briefly the old New Left in the 1960s and the new Left, which is the people rampaging on today's campuses at Middlebury and Berkeley and Yale and my own Claremont, McKenna. When Heather was there, we could tell that story a little bit later. She was a victim of some of these protesters last spring in California. But you are familiar with that problem, I think. Well, the old New Left defined itself against an even older left, by which it meant both dogmatic Marxists and mainstream American liberals. And the 60s New Left, especially Tom Hayden, sort of its poet, philosopher, as you were, if you will, who wrote the most famous statement of youthful protest from the early 1960s, the so-called Port Huron statement from Port Huron, a place in Michigan, on Lake Michigan. Hayden and the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and the New Left, the campus New Left back then, rejected Marx, especially because of his determinism, his economic influence. They liked the early Marx, but not the later Marx. They preferred communists who were active to communists who were theoretical. They liked the examples of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, for example. But Hayden and the campus left also disliked not simply the old Marxist left, but the current mainstream left. Names like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Daniel Bell and Reinhold Niebuhr and many others who were at the top of the list of best-selling authors in the 1950s and who were read widely all over America and into the 1960s. Hayden identified with their critics, with the radicals against the liberals. These were false liberals, he said, who had abandoned their youthful dreams and great optimism in favor of a kind of false pragmatism and a love of government programs and bureaucracies and the kinds of things that Lyndon Johnson was elected to fulfill. Well, campus protesters today have a very different affect. They have a very different presentation of themselves. And in comparison, I think there was something ingenuous and almost admirable about the 60s radicals, about the SDS and their early manifesto. Tom Hayden had been a freedom rider. He'd gotten beaten up in Mississippi by the KKK, jailed in Georgia, and other such things. And he and his comrades were appalled by the racial bigotry of the American South. And they revered, at least in the beginning, the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 1950s. Indeed, the Port Huron statement quotes Abraham Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence, even as the civil rights leaders of the day did, accusing the country of not living up to its own principles. They assailed American hypocrisy and the apathy and alienation that went with it. But there's no such Americanism, or even however vestigial it might be, remaining, I think, in today's campus protesters. They celebrate only victims, not martyrs, and they have been taught to believe that America and the West as a whole are oppressors and nothing but oppressors, all the way down, violators of identity politics, and they regale them as racists, sexists, Islamophobes, homophobes, xenophobes, transphobes. The early SDS wanted to reintroduce utopia and hope, the SDS said in its statement. We are a far cry from utopia and hope on campus today. What happened to that passionate idealism? That is the question I want to say something about. The SDS regarded the university as the locus of the new American politics. Because despite its faults, it stood as the only mainstream institution that was open to individuals of nearly any viewpoint. They honored the university as a community of controversy, a slogan from the Port Huron statement, no safe spaces or trigger warnings for them, and they championed the personal cultivation of the mind, even, as over against the specialization of the bureaucratic academy of the day. Today's protesters are quite different from that. Their ideology, their theory is very different. It is grounded much more in race and the doctrine of race and in a form of postmodernism which is really far beyond what the radicals in the 60s had in mind, certainly in the beginning of the 1960s. So far as I can tell, the ideology of the new campus left was born from a shotgun marriage of critical legal studies, a radical enthusiasm in law schools, particularly at Harvard, just when Barack Obama was studying there in the early 1980s, and radical feminism, a marriage consummated on a bed of postmodern philosophy. And what drew these two groups together was the discovery that formal or legal equality, by then essentially achieved or at least guaranteed for blacks and women, did not guarantee the equality of results. And above all, didn't guarantee the most essential aspect of equality of results, the feeling of equal recognition and respect. And they joined together in pursuit of that comprehensive equality and of the high that only that feeling could give, and dared any man to put asunder what Harvard Law School had brought together. And so if one looks and takes seriously what radicals on campus say today, it is quite contradictory and quite dreary. On the one hand, they believe that race is a pervasive fact, and that American society is built on a system of structural racism, which is pervasive and powerful and all-shaping. And on the other hand, they believe that racism is a social construction, and that it's all in the mind, that it may have a social side to it, but it's essentially an attitude. And the problem is that genuine systemic racism is now so rare that the activists themselves admit that they have to target micro-aggressions, not macro-aggressions. What happened to the macro-aggressions of segregation, slavery, Jim Crow? All of that is, one could say with some exaggeration, gone, or essentially gone. And if all of society is based on white supremacy, why do campus protesters spend so much time policing Halloween costumes? Which, was the cause of the outbreak at Yale and at Claremont McKenna, an earlier outbreak at Claremont McKenna. The small things they obsess about and the large causes, impersonal forces they allege are behind them are strikingly contradictory, or at least, let's say, discordant. Given this combination of postmodernism and obsession with race, it's, I think, no wonder that liberal idealism, or any sort of idealism, is in short supply on today's campuses. Postmodernism is not about justice, as it admits. There's no justice out there. It's about the will to power. When you add that to a racial consciousness whose invidiousness would make the antebellum South proud, and you have a very ugly combination that plays itself out in identity politics. Hence, young people who can be vicious and violent in packs, on campus and off campus, can seem despondent and quite fragile at heart when you speak to them as individuals. Idealism depends on transcending self-interest, and today's protesters expect every ethnic, racial, class, and gender group to follow its interests, its values, and the most powerful to win. As I said, we are a long way from utopia and hope. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I thought, Heather, since Charles had a chance to respond to Mark, did you have anything to say about his argument that since the 80s we've had a bit of a hyper-individualized libertarianism that's been driving as a sort of mirror image to the individual identity politics on the left, on the right?
Well, I certainly appreciate and sympathize with Mark's instinct to want to have the sort of a, on the one hand, on the other hand, political balance and see a mirror structure there. But to be honest, I'm not buying it. I really, I don't think that he gives a fair representation of Reagan conservatism. Not that I'm particularly invested, believe it or not, in Reagan, but I think that I think he exaggerates the libertarianism of the right, even as he did acknowledge the idea that conservatives do support a American identity based on family, community institutions. So I simply do not see much of a parallelism between a anti-government, to be, as put it as most starkly as possible, a suspicion of big government on the right, and the identity politics of the left. I also think that both Professor Kesler and Professor Lilla have understated the virulence and dangers of this. The fact that the left identity politics really is based in hatred. It is, and I do not think it's about the feeling of vulnerability. I frankly believe that those psychological claims are a cover for a political agenda of trying to discredit any traditional Western civilization. The left is not libertarian. They are making claims as groups upon a group. If this was a matter of everybody pursuing his own identity, it would make logical sense what we're seeing now, which is a very inchoate, very hesitant, very nascent whispering of a white identity politics as a reaction to the dominant color-based, gender-based identity politics on the left. It's tit for tat. But in fact, that identity politics is immediately denounced as white supremacy. So this is not a question of every group cultivating his own identity in the sort of solitude of his aloneness. This is a political program to radically assert victimhood and to cast the most black aspersions on the Western civilization project of trying to create the greatest possible expansion of the human mind and human spirit.
Mark, did you want to respond to Heather or Charles at all before we open it up for questions?
Well, we probably ought to go to the floor given the time, but just very quickly, it seems to me the missing element in this, even in the analysis that I've given of identity politics, is American Puritanism. It has become an evangelical project, and in that sense is as American as apple pie. People want to convert you. They want you to see the world the way they do. It becomes a moral cause. All sense of proportion is lost. So a lot of this springs out of Jonathan Edwards. We're not just the founding fathers, we're also Jonathan Edwards, and we're also Pentecostal preachers speaking in tongues and throwing snakes around. That's also America, and that's deeply in us. And there's a lot of that kind of circus quality of American evangelicalism that's to be found here that, you know, adds another dimension to this. You know, as I say in the book, the American mind is divided. On the one hand, we hear the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, and on the other, we hear the laughter of Mark Twain, right? And when Mark Twain starts sleeping in one of our periods, then this evangelical, moralistic, unrealistic strain in our thinking and our being, which you don't find anywhere else. Except maybe on the German left a little bit today, but you don't find anywhere else. This movement is as American as apple pie, and that is part of the problem.
I was talking to Peter Wood the other day at the National Association of Scholars, and he's working on an essay, at least, maybe even a book, trying to figure out the fact of identity politics and its protest culture. And he argues, or is developing the argument, that it's a version of sort of group protest as religious experience. And, so it touches on some of your themes. You may not come to your conclusions, but we'll start right here. Please wait for the microphone. She's coming right at you.
Yeah, this question was addressed to Mark Lilla, but I'm interested in what anybody says. So, Professor Lilla, you talk about collective responsibility, solidarity, mutual aid and support, and I think many in this room would find that appealing. I do. But one thing you never mentioned is individual responsibility, and I think that goes along with it. This is an idea developed on the right that in order to have an effective form or an effective system of collective responsibility, it is necessary for people not to exploit that responsibility, to show individual restraint, take responsibility on themselves to minimize the burden on the collective. I think the right has been much more proficient in developing that argument than the left. It seems to me that any mention of responsibility, personal responsibility, is now anathema on the left. So I'd ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, no, there's much to what you say, right? But the experience, I think, people on the left will tell you, is that the argument for individual responsibility, which I take very seriously, I share that with you, and I think there's a reciprocal relationship between individual and social responsibility, is simply a way of shirking social responsibility. Because that has been, in my view, the experience of real existing Reaganism, not Reaganism on paper, right? Is that we will simply cut everything, every chance we have. And so it would be good to get to a place where one party or one side could articulate the relationship between individual and social responsibility and make good on both.
Yes, sir.
I'll keep it brief and follow up on Heather's comment. Basically, you can be a wise Latina, you can be a proud transgender person, but you can't be white. Now, what happens if you make it concrete, a white student association, or you pass out pamphlets on campuses saying, it's okay to be white? That's been happening lately, and there are deans out there who are calling it provocation. You know, it's rousing up the people. So I'll put this question out. Why don't, if every group has their defenders, their organizations, but the one group that cannot speak up are whites. Any reaction?
Yeah, and it's a good thing too, in my view. Blackness is a product of history. It is a product of slavery. There is a black identity because of slavery. It's nothing bred in the bone or anything else. It becomes an identity because people have shared a destiny based on what happened to them, and that's a reality. Now, whiteness develops as an ideology in relation, I think, to this experience, and then there's black ideology that tries to capture, what has happened on the other side, but there is no whiteness. But there is a blackness that comes from a certain experience, There are Polish Americans, there are Italian Americans, there are Finnish Americans, there are no white
I'll just say, I mean, practically speaking, you can't have identity politics for every group except whites.
It's true.
I mean, once you go down that road, you are inviting a white assertiveness of some kind to emerge. It's better not to go down that road. And it's better to stick to the ideal of the colorblind constitution, the ideal of human rights, because human beings don't have a color. They can come in many different colors. They have an essence, but it's not it's not a physical essence. It's not a weight. It's not a size. It's not a color. It's not a hair color. It's being a rational animal, and they come in all colors. And I think it is much safer for us to get back to the notion that your rights attach to your humanity rather than to these other traits, which tend to be, as I was saying, sub-rational and lead you down into some very sinister rabbit holes, many of them.
Well, obviously the left wants it both ways. You know, race is a construct, and yet race is the most important thing of my identity, and it is real. So it's a completely contradictory discourse, but it is very dangerous. I think if this keeps on going, we are working towards a situation, I think, of very severe social and possibly racial conflict. So something has to be pulled back, because the hatred that is being generated is not going to go away without taking some serious victims, I think.
But I don't think it's a contradiction. It's not a contradiction because millions of people arrived on our shores and were told they were black. It never occurred to them before. What do you know? I'm black. And that, having been labeled, created a historical experience that in reality created a shared experience that turned it into an identity. It's simply different. And it's important to address the specificity of the black experience. Now, that's one of my problems with identity politics as currently practiced. It levels a playing field and says that, that black experience is the same as victimhood of women, is the same as the victimhood of the transgender, and so on. To my mind, the black experience is apart and needs to be addressed apart in order to become our country. But it's not about identity as this general thing, and it's not about every group.
Sure. She's almost there.
I see progressivism as something of a military operation. In the early 30s, there was Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist progressive, who was jailed. And he was jailed because he advocated a violent revolution. And he came to the conclusion that a violent revolution cannot succeed. So his mantra, which has been carried forward, is that we must march through the institutions, which they did. The so-called intelligentsia, that's what they're doing, and they're using all these side issues to get ahead. Now, regarding your statement, Professor, about the evangelicals, I'm a Catholic, and I speak to a lot of Catholics, and the evangelicals had no influence on our thinking. And when you come up with the identity politics, I identify myself, which a lot of others in a different way. I am a Catholic with Polish extraction, born in the United States.
Me too.
We have time for just one more.
Thank you. This is mostly for Professor Lilla, but anybody that wishes to answer. I think with some oversimplification, describe the change in the metaphysics of the population in the last half a century or so, or maybe change in the value system of the people. And the question is, how much of that do you think is attributable to the disgust with the nomenclaturas because of their abuse?
Or discuss with what?
discussed the nomenclaturas.
Yeah, no,
You know what I'm talking
speaking
about?
Russian now.
Right. They sell nomenclatura for their abusive behavior as well as their intrinsic corruption. And then the question is there any similarity, relationship, connection with what the founding fathers found themselves fighting against? The second point is, second question, is that we, when it's all said and done, simply being witnesses of the fact that this population, we, are well on our way on the road to serfdom. And the third one, the conclusion is, is there a difference in quality, value, between Brandenburg Concept number 3 and the jungle drums? Thank you.
Well, I only feel confident to take up the first question of the nomenclatura. You know, I was an editor of the Public Interest back in the early 1980s, and people were making a lot at the time of this notion of an adversary culture, or a kind of liberal nomenclatura, right? And, you know, I sort of drank the Kool-Aid, I have to say, and it took a while for me to step outside of that and see what was true and what was false about that. You know, if there's a nomenclatura today, it's not a liberal one. It's those of us who are educated, have higher education, have opportunities, have a global outlook in the sense that our passports have stamps in them. You know, are simply living very different sorts of lives from other people in this country, and that's not a healthy thing for the country, right? And both of those are genuine experiences. Not like the true people are those who don't do that, right? You know, that's always the lie at the bottom of populism, that part of the people is the true people, right? And you know, it's been an important myth on the right. You know, I can't believe every time I listen to Fox News and I hear the mainstream media. I mean, up until Trump's election, Fox News was the most popular cable news station. You are the damn mainstream media. Yeah? You know? And you dominate all sorts of things in Washington, right? And I see the shaking heads, and it's interesting. When I talk to liberal groups, they shake their heads when they say how powerful they are, because they say Republicans control this stuff in the economy and in government. And then I talk in front of conservative groups, and they say, are you kidding? They're the ones who control everything, because they control the culture, right? And there is some kind of dividing of spoils there, I have to admit, right? But there is no one class like that. There are conservative, right-wing intellectuals with their magazines, with their networks, with their summer schools. You are not just regular folks. I'm sorry if you're in this room. You are part of an elite. And even when you think you're speaking for the non-elite, you are still part of the elite. You are not sharing the life destinies of people in my hometown of Macomb County, Michigan. So don't flatter yourself that you're speaking for those people.
Well, part of Claremont's project has always been the elite education project. but at its core was always the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which are colorblind, even though it took more than a century and many, many dead in the Civil War to realize those promises. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There's coffee service being set up in the next few minutes, so stick around if you'd like to. Thank you.